A spacecraft belonging to the Life Foundation is returning to Earth with some valuable items. However, things begin to go awry when the spacecraft catches fire and crash lands in eastern Malaysia. The CEO of the Life Foundation, Drake, gets completely nervous when he finds out that one of the 4 items that the spacecraft brought is missing. The valuable items are actually symbiotic life forms that the crew found on a comet, and Drake ordered them to bring them along. Drake, a cold-hearted innovator, is more worried about finding the missing symbiote than the safety of the crew members, who are in a critical situation. One of the crew members is found to be in an even more drastic situation, and he is rushed to a nearby medical facility. While they are taking him to the hospital, the injured crew member miraculously wakes up and begins to attack the medical personnel with his symbiotic monstrous powers. The ambulance crashes, and the crew member passes on his symbiote to one of the female EMTs present in the ambulance. Just when the symbiote enters her body, the wounds of the female EMT's body begin to heal, and she starts to wander cluelessly. The symbiote acts as a parasite that completely controls what a person thinks and how he acts. This is where the story and the life of the famous and unbiased investigative journalist Eddie Brock is going to change forever. Eddie is known for providing clear and unfiltered coverage of different events, and Eddie doesn't care if his job is affected by it or not. He just wants to show the world reality and wants to uncover the faces of some of the biggest corrupt individuals in the world. Eddie is called in by his boss, and his boss informs him that Eddie is being called in by Drake to provide him with an exclusive interview regarding the spacecraft crash. Drake wants to assure him that the crash was nothing but an accident. Eddie makes it clear to his boss that he wants no part of it, as Drake is corrupt. Eddie's boss lets him know that Drake has enough money to put anyone out of business, and Eddie has to take his interview in order to ensure his job. When he is not in the right mood, Eddie finds comfort in talking to his lovely and kind fiancée. Eddie lets her know that he doesn't feel like taking Drake's interview, as that person is not who the entire world thinks he is, and tells him to just do his job with patience, and he can go back to his daily routine. Eddie also learns that Anne is preparing a lawsuit defense for the Life Foundation. Anne, who also believes that everything should be done in a true light, makes it clear to Eddie that she is doing what her firm is asking her to do, rather than defending Drake in this case. Later that night, when Eddie wakes up in the middle of the night for a drink, he finds that Anne has received a new email on her laptop. Eddie decides to look into it without Anne finding out about it. The email includes a file on the Life Foundation case, in which Anne is presented with different individuals who have passed away due to the Foundation's unethical testing and procedures. Anne, in this particular scenario, is supposed to defend the wrongful acts of the Life Foundation. Eddie, who still wants to uncover the true face of Drake in front of the whole world, decides to mess with Drake during his interview. The very next day, when Eddie does meet with Drake for the very first time, he begins to impress Drake by listing off Drake's numerous accomplishments at the start of the interview. But Drake has no idea what kind of journalist Eddie is. After listing off his various achievements, Eddie begins to turn the tables and starts to ask Drake about the unethical practices of the Foundation and how Drake's entire empire is built on lies, corruption, and bodies. Not wanting to proceed with the interview at all, Drake asks security to escort Eddie outside. Had Eddie been aware of what was about to come next, maybe he would have taken a simple interview and called it a day. Drake, being the egomaniac pioneer he is, uses his contacts to not only get Eddie fired, but also his fiancée as well. Eddie is heartbroken, but it doesn't even stop there. Anne, who is so upset that Eddie has always thought about himself and not her, decides to call off their engagement and leaves Eddie's life forever. Knowing he already caused enough damage, Eddie decides to not bother Anne anymore. Meanwhile, it is just a normal day for Drake, who doesn't care about his actions. He gets elated when his precious symbiotes arrive, and he can't wait to test them out. Drake is aware of the power those symbiotes hold, and his motives may not be all that pure. On the flip side, the female EMT who is possessed by one of the symbiotes enters the city and causes havoc. She goes over to a much older woman and transfers the symbiote onto her. The old female begins to move forward with more energy than ever. About 6 months later, Drake is testing his symbiotes on various animals, and one of his scientists, Dora, tells Drake that the symbiote can only survive in an oxygen-rich environment. Symbiotes cannot survive without oxygen-breathing hosts, and they need to bond themselves with a respiratory host in order to survive on Earth. After several attempts, a symbiote is able to attach itself to a rabbit, and it excites Drake to the point where he orders for the human trials to begin. Dora is skeptical of Drake's request because it is an ethical concern, as humans cannot be sacrificed to symbiotes like that. Knowing what he is capable of, Drake threatens Dora to proceed with Drake's orders, or Dora will see her family suffer. While Drake may be getting everything he wants, Eddie, on the other hand, doesn't seem to be doing good. He has been living in a clunky old apartment and has no job. What's even worse for him, he has lost all of his confidence. That is made more evident when he is scared to stop a thief from robbing his friend Chen's convenience store. Eddie spends most of his day searching for any job he can find, but Eddie's life isn't at the highest of highs right now, as nobody wants to hire him. This is mainly because of how Eddie went up against a strong man like Drake, and nobody wants to hire a man who Drake is after. Drake, using his unethical practices, has taken several homeless people off the street, but the poor souls aren't aware of what is going to happen to them. Drake experiments on his first human subject, and unleashes one of his symbiotes on him. Despite humans being the perfect respiratory hosts, the symbiote cannot bond with everyone. The human subject falls prey to the symbiote in seconds, and Drake, who has no feelings and empathy towards anyone, asks to bring out the next human subject. Dora has had enough of Drake's immoral experiment and decides to take the matter into her own hands. She decides to gain the help of Eddie, as she believes that he is perfect for this job. At Chen's store, Dora finds Eddie, but is getting shy in talking to him. Eddie, however, doesn't give Dora the answer she was looking for, as Eddie lost everything he cared about because he thought he was strong enough to go after Drake. Eddie refuses to help Dora and wishes her good luck with whatever she is trying to do. Desperately wanting to meet Anne and hoping to make amends with her, Eddie decides to go and meet her after several months. Eddie was expecting that Anne would have missed him too, but that isn't the case. As a matter of fact, Anne has completely moved on with her life, and she has found a new boyfriend named Dan. Dan is a surgeon. She introduces Dan to Eddie, who meets Eddie politely and lets him and Anne sort things out. Eddie is happy to see Anne making good choices in her life, and Anne, who also misses Eddie sometimes, tells Eddie that she has moved on, and Eddie should do the same. Not wanting to mess up her perfect life anymore, and considering how Drake was the one who caused Anne to break up with him, Eddie decides to join hands with Dora to put an end to Drake's corrupt organization and practices. Dora sneaks Eddie into the Life Foundation and explains to him how the spacecraft came across a comet and brought several symbiotes with them. Dora further adds that Drake believes that the Earth is nearing extinction, and symbiosis is the key to humanity's survival. Drake wants humans to bond with symbiotes, and later on, inhabit the same planet the symbiotes come from. Before he can get caught by the security guard, Dora pushes Eddie to the unit where the homeless individuals are locked up. Eddie looks around the facility with fear, as he still has no clear idea what's going on. He explores the different units, in which several individuals are locked up. Eddie begins to take pictures with his smartphone as proof. Eddie comes across a unit and finds a homeless woman named Maria in it. Eddie is familiar with her, as she lives outside Eddie's apartment building. She begins to yell at Eddie to help her out, but before Eddie can do anything, the alarm goes off. Eddie isn't aware that one of the symbiotes has bonded with Maria. Maria breaks out of her unit and jumps on Eddie, and immediately transfers the symbiote onto him. Eddie, who still isn't aware of what has truly happened to him, runs out of the Life Foundation. Several armed personnel go after Eddie, but Eddie, without even noticing it, uses his insane symbiote powers to escape the armed forces. The symbiote in Eddie makes him climb a tall tree in a matter of few seconds, and Eddie has no clue how he was able to do that. Eddie returns to his apartment and is completely exhausted. The symbiote inside his body has now started to take a toll on him. Eddie starts to show strange symptoms, like excessive hunger. Eddie starts to eat everything from the refrigerator, and even starts to eat rotten food out of the trash can. Meanwhile, the old woman who bonded with the other symbiote passed it on to a small girl who is about to arrive in Eddie's city. It seems like the symbiote in the little girl is trying to make its way back to the other symbiotes. Considering what he has observed over the past few days, Eddie decides to meet Anne instantly and tell her everything. Drake finds out that another one of his symbiotes has escaped, but he isn't aware that Eddie is the one who took it. Drake also learns that one of his test subjects has bonded perfectly with another symbiote, and Drake concludes that time is needed to achieve symbiosis. Anne is having a luxurious lunch with Dan, and when Eddie shows up, he starts to behave strangely all of a sudden. He gets all sweaty and hungry on the spot, and starts to eat from Dan's plate like a madman. Anne wonders if Eddie is drunk or not, and when Dan goes to check up on him, he finds out that Eddie's body is burning up. Eddie behaves erratically at the restaurant, and the restaurant manager orders Eddie to leave immediately. Dan, who is an acclaimed doctor, orders Eddie to come to the hospital and get himself checked. Eddie is taken right away into the hospital. When he is placed in the MRI machine, the high-pitched noise of the machine starts to affect the symbiote inside Eddie. Eddie comes out of the machine in extreme pain. While he is traveling back to his apartment, Eddie begins to hear a horrifying voice inside his head. The security guards have found out that Dora was the one who brought an unauthorized person into the building, which is why one of the symbiotes got away. Eddie gets a call from Anne and is informed that he has a parasite inside his body. Eddie starts to question Dan about the stuff he has recently been experiencing. The voice inside Eddie's head begins to get loud, and it makes Eddie more frustrated and furious. Drake finds out that, upon being exposed to a high-pitched noise, the symbiote is destroyed in mere seconds. Drake loses his symbiote when one of his human subjects passes away. Drake also questions Dora about why she went behind his back and betrayed him. Dora defends herself by saying that she began to doubt their practice to the point where she thought she needed someone to stop Drake. Drake promises Dora that they will be changing their ways of performing tests, but she has to tell him who she brought to the Life Foundation. If Dora had known what was going to happen to her if she gave up Eddie's name, maybe she would have thought twice. Upon saying Eddie's name, Drake gets furious and unleashes one of his symbiotes on Dora as a punishment. Dora is murdered along with the symbiote. As he is preparing to have dinner, several of Drake's mercenaries arrive at Eddie's apartment and demand Eddie give up the symbiote. Eddie tries to surrender, but is also not sure what the mercenaries are actually trying to say. The symbiote takes control of Eddie's body and turns into a horrific, monstrous creature. The symbiote beats most of the mercenaries and helps Eddie in escaping his apartment. Drake is watching all of this unfold and is elated to see how Eddie has adapted so well to the symbiote inside his body. Drake orders his men to quickly bring in Eddie unharmed, as he has been the only one who has perfectly adapted to the symbiote. Drake's armed men begin to chase Eddie, who runs away on his bike. Eddie is no longer in control of his body, as the symbiote is doing most of the job. The symbiote protects Eddie in such a manner that Eddie is able to outrun most of Drake's men. However, that doesn't last long, as Eddie gets into a scary accident and injures himself severely. Just when one of Drake's men thinks that he has got control of Eddie, the symbiote begins to manifest around Eddie's body and introduces itself in its complete form. The symbiote eats one of Drake's men and runs away to the other part of the city. The symbiote finally shows itself to Eddie and introduces itself as Venom. It explains to Eddie that it found him, rather than Eddie finding Venom. Venom instructs Eddie to reach Drake's rocket as soon as possible. It also warns Eddie that he must cooperate if he wants to survive. Dan further looks at Eddie's reports and concludes that the parasite is like nothing the world has never seen before. Eddie's internal organs are behaving abnormally. Dan asks Anne to go find Eddie and bring him to the hospital. When Anne reaches Eddie's apartment and finds the entire building completely wrecked, she assumes that something is terribly wrong. Eddie decides to head back to his former boss's office so that he can deliver the proof that Drake is up to something terrible. When he reaches the building where he used to work, Venom propels Eddie to let it eat the security guard Eddie is close friends with. Eddie refuses to let Venom do something like that ever again. Eddie uses Venom to reach the top of the building, enter his former boss's office, and leave his smartphone, which has all of the evidence that Drake is a corrupt individual. Before he can leave the building, more of Drake's mercenaries arrive and begin to shoot at Eddie. Venom takes control once again and starts beating the mercenaries like they are absolutely nothing. Anne arrives just in time and witnesses what Eddie has turned into. Anne gets scared, but Eddie stops her from running away and tries to explain everything. Anne orders Eddie to come with her to the hospital, and Venom senses that Anne and Eddie truly have feelings for one another. While they are traveling, Anne questions Eddie about everything regarding Venom. Venom also adds that other than high-pitched noises, fire can also destroy symbiotes with ease. As Venom can see into Eddie's mind, it tells Eddie to apologize to Anne for ruining her life. Knowing he might not get the chance again, Eddie does apologize to Anne with all of his heart. On the other hand, the small child infected by the parasite arrives at Drake's building, and Drake, thinking he has lost all his symbiotes, has no clue who the small girl is or how she got into the building. Dan explains to Eddie that the thing inside Eddie is slowly destroying him. Venom finds Dan to be a threat and begins to hurt Dan. Anne takes control and uses the high-pitched noise of the MRI machine to stop Venom. The noise is strong enough to make the symbiote come out of Eddie's body. Dan is stunned to see something like this and isn't sure what to do next. Eddie leaves the hospital as Venom is no longer a part of him, but Drake's men arrive once again and capture Eddie. Venom transfers itself into a small dog at the hospital, and it enters Anne's body so that it can head back to Eddie. Drake interrogates Eddie ruthlessly and asks where Venom is. When Eddie refuses to answer politely, Drake scares Eddie by turning into something else. The small girl carried the symbiote called Riot, the most powerful of them all, and she transferred it to Drake. Eddie confesses that he has no idea where Venom is. Drake instructs his men to take Eddie into the woods and finish him once and for all. Before his men can terminate Eddie for good, Anne arrives in her own Venom persona and defeats every single one of Drake's men. She makes out with Eddie passionately and transfers Venom back to him. Venom makes it clear to Eddie that it likes him. They have to stop Drake from leaving Earth with Riot. Venom informs Eddie that Riot was their leader back on their planet, and it is now influencing Drake to go back there and bring million more symbiotes to Earth. Drake has now gone completely insane and orders his team to prepare for the launch of the spacecraft as soon as possible. Drake can't wait any longer, and he lets Riot take control as they run their way to the spacecraft. Venom arrives, and both of them engage in a hellacious battle. Riot is just too powerful to be put down with ease, but as Venom has a much stronger host in the form of Eddie, the fight isn't completely one-sided. Anne arrives at the aid of Eddie and uses the sound system to create a high-pitched noise. The noise propels both of the symbiotes to fuse for some time. Eddie and Drake are separated from their respective symbiotes, and both of them fight each other. Just when he thought he had defeated Eddie, Venom re-enters his body and heals all of his wounds. Drake and Riot enter the spacecraft, and the spacecraft takes off, but Venom arrives just in time to blow it up, exterminating both Drake and Riot. As a massive fire is caused, Venom falls prey to it as well. Eddie is heartbroken, as he was beginning to bond with his symbiote. Sometime later, Eddie has got his old job back, and is friends with Anne again. Anne believes that Venom was lost in the fire, but she isn't aware that Venom is alive and still bonded with Eddie. Venom asks Eddie to get back with Anne, but he believes that Anne is better off without him for the time being. Eddie makes some ground rules if Venom wants to live with him. He makes it clear that Venom cannot just devour anyone. However, it can feast on extremely bad guys. Eddie enters Chen's shop and finds the same thief who robbed her before. Venom wastes no time in finishing off the thief. It is clear that Venom is here to stay with Eddie forever. A few months later, Eddie is brought in to interview an imprisoned madman named Cletus Cassidy. Cletus looks at Eddie with a wicked smile and promises that there will be carnage when he leaves the prison for good. Eddie looks back at him and senses that the danger he took care of is still around, in some shape and form.